Thanks so much, friends. Thanks so much. It's so great to be with you. I want to begin with Philip Yancey's retelling of one of Jesus' famous parables. A young girl grows up on a cherry orchard just outside of Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents, a bit old-fashioned, tend to overreact at her nose ring, the music she listens to, and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times, and she seethes inside. "I hate you," she screams at her father when he knocks at the door of her room after an argument. And that night, she acts on a plan that she had mentally rehearsed scores of times. She runs away. She's visited Detroit only once before on a bus trip with her church youth group to watch the Tigers play because media in Traverse City report in lurid detail the gangs, the drugs, and the violence in downtown Detroit. She concludes that it's probably the last place that her parents will go looking for her. They'll never find her in Detroit. Her second day there, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she's ever seen. He offers her a ride, buys her lunch, arranges a place for her to stay. He gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She was right all along, she decides. My parents were keeping all the fun from me. The good life continues for about a month, and then 2 months, a year. The man with the big car, she calls him boss, teaches her a few things that men like. Since she's underage, men pay a premium for her. She lives in a penthouse and orders room service whenever she wants. Occasionally, she thinks about the folks back home, but their lives now seem so boring that she can hardly believe she grew up there. After a year, the first sallow signs of illness appear, and it amazes her how fast the boss turns mean. "These days, you just can't mess around," he growls. And before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. She still turns a couple tricks at night, but they don't pay much, and all the money goes to support her habit. When winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on metal grates outside the big department stores. I guess sleeping is the wrong word. A teenage girl at night in downtown Detroit can never relax her guard. Dark bands circle her eyes, her cough worsens. One night, she lies awake listening for footsteps. All of a sudden, everything about her life looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a lost little girl, cold in a frightening city. She begins to whimper. Her pockets are empty and she's hungry. She needs a fix. She pulls her legs tight underneath her and shivers under the cardboard she's piled atop her coat. Something jolts a synapse of memory, and a single image fills her mind of May in Traverse City when a million cherry trees blossom at once, with her golden retriever dashing through the rows and rows of blossomy trees in chase of a tennis ball. "God, why did I leave?" she says to herself, and pain stabs at her heart. "My dog back home eats better than I do now." She's sobbing, and she knows in a flash that more than anything else in the entire world, she just wants to go home. 3 straight phone calls, 3 straight connections with voicemail. She hangs up without leaving a message the first 2 times, but the third time she leaves a voicemail. "Dad, Mom, it's me. I was wondering about maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus up your way. I guess I'll be there tomorrow night at midnight. If you're not there, I guess I'll just keep going until I hit Canada." It takes about 7 hours for a bus to make all the stops between Detroit and Traverse City. Her thoughts bounce back and forth between those worries and the speech she's preparing for her father. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. It's not your fault. It's all mine. Dad, can you forgive me?" She says the words over and over and over, her throat tightening even as she rehearses them. She hasn't apologized to anyone in years. When the bus finally rolls into the station, its air breaks, hissing in protest. The driver announces in a crackly voice over the microphone, 15 minutes, folks. That's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She checks herself in the compact mirror, smooths her hair, and licks the lipstick off her teeth. She looks at the tobacco stains on her fingertips and wonders if her parents will notice, even if they're there. She walks into the terminal not knowing what to expect. And not one of the 1,000 scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees next. There in the concrete walls and plastic chairs bus terminal in Traverse City, Michigan, stands a group of 40 people. Brothers, sisters, great aunts, uncles, cousins, and a grandmother and a great-grandmother to boot. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers. And taped across the entire wall of the terminal is a homemade banner that reads, "Welcome home." Out of the crowd of well-wishers breaks her father. She stares out through the tears quivering in her eyes like hot mercury and begins her memorized speech. "Dad, I'm sorry, I know," but he interrupts her. "Hush, child. We've got no time for that. No time for apologies. You'll be late for the party. A banquet's waiting for you at home." Sound familiar? Isn't there something inside of us when we hear a story like that that just wakes up? Isn't there something inside of our souls that we're just drawn to that powerful presence of grace, like a bug to a light? There's something about the stories of Jesus and stories of grace that just wake us up, and it's irresistible, isn't it? I find it fascinating, though, that we find ourselves living in a cultural moment where the story of Christianity and church is anything but irresistible, right? I mean, we've all read reports of the rise of the nuns, and not the Catholic in you, and not that at all, no. The nuns, the no religious affiliation. You know, in 2003, it was about 9% of Americans say they had no religious affiliation. In 2023, just a few years ago, it had risen to 21%. Barna's done a bunch of research about what comes to people's minds when they think about church people and Christians, and the words are terrifying. They're racist, politically extreme, homophobic, hateful, hypocritical. There's something about the way that our Christianity is lived out in the public square today and how people are experiencing it that is just so resistible. But here's the thing. You follow Jesus around in the Gospels, and oh my gosh, it's anything but resistible. It's irresistible. I mean, I'll go as far to say this, that people that were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, right? They were drawn to Jesus like a bug to a light, weren't they? I mean, prostitutes, tax collectors, traitors to the nation of Israel, they wanted to be around Jesus. The most notorious sinners, what the New Testament would call the scum of the earth, the outsiders were drawn to Jesus. Heck, can you just remember, like in the Christmas story, the angel's announcement to the shepherds about this arrival of the Messiah, Jesus? This is what the angels said. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. The news of the arrival of Jesus, you guys, is something that's supposed to spark joy inside of us, not dread, not take it or leave it, very resistible. No, it's something that causes great joy for all people. Then why so? Just a couple months ago, as there was a construction crew working on our new church home at Bridgeway in Kokomo, Indiana, I was building a relationship with one of these guys and hanging out and talking all the time. I invited him to our grand opening. I'm like, man, I'd love for you to sit with me at our grand opening. And he goes, Joel, like, man, I already feel bad enough about myself. Why would I go to church and feel worse? Right? Gut punch. It felt so awful because what he had experienced of Christianity, of the way of Jesus, of church people, made him feel worse. But that's not the original good news. Like, what has happened? Why is it that this message of Jesus seems to be so resistible when the original version was irresistible? And so many smart people have got lots of different answers to this, and I'm not going to be comprehensive at all this evening, but there are a couple things I think are happening here. First, I think this is true, that we've diluted the definition of grace. We've simply believed that grace is just a get-out-of-hell-free card because of what Jesus did. It's like this thing that I accept one time, and it's good for me, and I can just go on and live my life, and I'll get to spend eternity with Jesus. I think we've diluted the definition of grace. Scott McKnight, one of my favorite New Testament scholars, in one of his latest books, he riffs on grace in beautiful poetic form. I want to read it with you. Grace is more than being lucky to be on God's side. Grace is God's goodness showered on people who have failed. Grace is God's love on those who think they are unlovable. Grace is God knowing what we are designed to be. Grace is God believing in us when we have given up on ourselves. Grace is someone at the end of the rope being handed new strength from God. He's not done. Grace is God unleashing his transforming power. Grace realigns and reroutes a life and a community. Grace is when you turn your worst enemy into your best friend. Grace takes people as they are and makes them what they can be. Grace ennobles, grace empowers, grace forgives, grace frees, grace transcends. Ultimately, grace transforms. Grace is so much more than just a get-out-of-hell free card because of what Jesus did. It's his powerful presence and transforming work and posture of the divine towards all of humanity. It's the best news we could ever experience. But so often I think we dilute what it is and then we just receive it, breathe it in, and stop the story right there. Another thing I think that has gone wrong, and one reason why the story of Christianity is so resistible to our neighbors, maybe even you tonight, is this right here. Too often, people who have been saved by grace, receive the grace of Jesus, we're bad at practicing grace. We're good at breathing it in, but we're bad at living it out and continuing to practice that grace. One of Jesus' disciples, Peter, near the end of his life, he writes in the New Testament about part of our role as Christ followers. He says this: each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. My brothers and sisters of Suncrest, when's the last time that you recognized and you've reckoned with part of your role as a follower of Jesus is to be a steward of God's grace, to distribute and dispense God's grace to a grace-thirsty world by serving in all of its various forms? Guys, this is part of our role. And this is what I want to challenge us all together with tonight, for us to recover the practice of practicing grace in our lives to our grace-thirsty world. Now, a couple challenges inside of this. First one, I want us to see that we can practice grace and dispense grace in our world in the face of brokenness and of suffering. Part of the problem of living in our fast-paced, not only cable news, but social media-drenched world is that we get trauma and tragedy fatigue often, don't we? I mean, there's one crisis here, and there's another one that pops up, and we forget about the crisis that's even still going on, and we're stuck thinking, what can we even do with it? So we just move on and bury our head in the sand and just say, oh, God bless their hearts. I'll shoot up a prayer for them, and we just move on. It's hard for us to move forward and do something about it. You guys, Jesus all the time was being interrupted by tragedies and by brokenness that would happen right in front of him. The Gospel of Matthew records for us after Jesus gives the great Sermon on the Mount, he steps off the hillside, he's immediately confronted with brokenness and with suffering right in front of him. And one of those accounts, we're told this in Matthew chapter 9. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. Jesus is going through his life and he's announcing that the kingdom of God is at hand, that the rule and the reign and the way of God from heaven is crashing into earth. And he's demonstrating the kingdom breaking into our world by healing every disease and sickness, by meeting people in their physical needs. The very next verse tells us this: when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. I love this so much. We're told that he has compassion on them, not just pity, not just, I feel bad for them, but he has compassion on them, and this changes everything in Jesus' behavior. The word compassion is the Greek word splagnizomai. It sounds like something you need to go to the doctor for, all right? Splagnizomai. But to have compassion, splagnizomai, means that his bowels hurt. He had a stomach ache. He saw brokenness and suffering, and he was compelled to do something about it so much that his physical body ached when he saw it. Whenever you see compassion talked about in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't just feel something, he goes to relieve it, to go to the lows of the lows, to do something about it, to meet the brokenness with his powerful posture of grace and his gracious love. And Jesus was always going to the lowest places to let his gracious love be known. He touched corpses and raised people back to life. He healed a servant boy of a Roman centurion, the enemy. You're going to serve that family? Yeah, it's grace. He invited tax collectors who were traitors to the nation of Israel, his ancestral people, to follow him and be a part of his crew. Because when he was faced with suffering and brokenness, he stepped in with grace to disrupt it. And you guys, that's what we're called to do as well. When we encounter brokenness and suffering, we step in and disrupt it with grace. I read a story a few years ago of Dr. William Cook, who was an idealistic young doctor just starting his practice in rural southern Indiana, in Austin, Indiana. And it was at the height of the opioid crisis. So he comes out of med school, starts his practice, thinking he's going to get in and really help people get healthy. And he's being inundated with people coming in, telling him that they're addicted to drugs and they can't kick the habit. And Cook talks about his judgmentalism and his critical spirit at first and how it made him start to feel a little jaded because he's thinking these people just need to stop. They're just reaping their consequences of using drugs, and he had this judgmental spirit about him. But Dr. Cook went to church, and he found himself being confronted by the compassion of Jesus reaching down to the lowest places to lift people up, no strings attached, no lectures included, just with his grace, helping people that are suffering. And he had a decision to make. Will I be critical? Will I be judgmental? Or will I follow the kingdom way of Jesus? He decided to do the latter. Cook said this as a quote from his book from 2019. When they come meet me, my patients, in the office, they need to know that the relationship is safe and they are not going to be turned away as less than human. They need to know that they are going to be seen as a person first, and then they are going to be provided access to the care they need. This is a follower of Jesus who recognizes that he has been called to be a dispenser of grace, to go down to the lowest places to meet suffering and brokenness with grace, no strings attached. And my friends, isn't this what Jesus did for us? He met us at our low places, no strings attached, offered his love to us, his mercy to us, his grace to us. We're called to join him in that. Another way that we practice grace is that we dispense grace in people's hinge moments of their life. You guys know what I'm talking about when I talk about a hinge moment? It's a moment in your life where everything changes. There's a before and after in this hinge moment of life. A couple ones for me. When I was in 8th grade, I'm showing my age a little bit. It was 2001, and the band U2 played at the NBA Finals halftime show, and they played Where the Streets Have No Name on national TV, and I was never the same after watching that. 2008, I saw The Dark Knight in IMAX. I was never the same. But on a more serious note, when I met my wife, Megan, now we've been married for 15 years, no one has changed my life more than my wife, my best friend, Megan. Or when I had a spiritual mentor take me to breakfast at IHOP, and he looked me in the eyes and he told me that I was being called into ministry. I was being volunteered into ministry, and he saw more in myself than I could ever possibly imagine. And oh my gosh, I can't believe the ride that I've been on ever since. We all have these hinge moments in life. There's also hinge moments in life that we all experience where we might find them graceless, where there's just no hope in a hinge moment that's graceless. Maybe it's during a life transition where you lost a marriage and you're going through a divorce and you feel there's no grace there. Or you lost a friendship, you lost a job, you moved communities, you moved faith communities, churches, and you feel like you're just lost and you're just hanging around in a life transition and you're isolated, you're all alone. Maybe for you, you've had a graceless hinge moment in life where you destroyed something, you broke something up, you detonated something, and you've got to live with the consequences, and you feel so guilty all the time. Maybe for you, you've had a graceless hinge moment of life where, something that you did went public, and you feel so much shame, and you feel like everybody knows the worst thing you ever did, and you're just sitting there in your shame. What's amazing about grace, you guys, is that grace disrupts our hinge moments and the shame of our hinge moments. And when it seems like guilt and shame and isolation have the last word in those before and after hinge moments, grace disrupts the cycle. Jesus knew this, and Jesus practiced this often. There's an account in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is on his way to help serve somebody else, and he gets interrupted. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. Now, this woman, because she had been bleeding, she was ceremonially unclean, so she couldn't worship with the rest of the community. She couldn't be in the marketplace with people. She could have no friends, not be around close family. This is someone who is a complete outcast. And she's looked for help from this affliction for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She's used all of her resources, and she's at the end of her rope. She is desperate. And so she goes to meet Jesus in a crowd of people trying to sneak attack Jesus. We're told this next. She came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Peter's like, Jesus, this is a silly question. Like, everyone's touching you is the answer to this question. But Jesus knew that there was somebody there who was in the middle of a before and after, everything changes, hinge moment. And he wasn't going to let this pass. Who touched me? There's power that's left me. We're told this in the very next verse. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Why is she trembling and why did she fall at Jesus' feet? She had just made this popular rabbi, Jesus, ceremonially unclean. She's probably thinking, I'm going to get a lecture, I'm going to get scolded, I'm going to become even more of an outcast, and I'm going to be kicked out of this corner of the town as well. And Jesus knows her desperation. He knows how everything is hinging on this moment. And then what does Jesus do? Jesus speaks these words. Then he said to her, daughter, this gentle, familial language, daughter, your faith has healed you. Your trust in me as the Messiah, as the King, it's healed you. Go in peace. The word for peace there is the word shalom, which means so much more than just an absence of conflict and tranquility. It's the Hebrew idea that you can go and be restored. Your life is now in rhythm with God. And here's the kicker. Your life is now in rhythm with your neighbors horizontally as well. You can be a part of the community again. Jesus restored her and brought her hope in her hinge moment. You guys, this is what we are called to do as we practice grace and be people that dispense grace to others. Now, one other way that I want to challenge us to practice grace is that we need to rebel against our culture's playbook for favor, power, and success. Any Star Wars fans in the room? I want to invite you into the great grace rebellion that our Heavenly Father has called us to. In 2004, the country of Ukraine was just 15 years removed from being a part of the USSR, part of the Soviet Union. They were moving slowly towards democracy. They held elections, but the ruling party at the time counted the votes. So how fair could those elections be, right? Viktor Yushchenko was this challenging person to challenge the ruling party. And even during the campaign, he was poisoned and maimed and disfigured from the poison, but he stayed on the ballot all the way through the election. On election day, the exit polls showed that Yushchenko had won in a landslide, but the party in power, again, they counted the votes and they controlled TV. That night, state-run television reported that Yushchenko had been decisively defeated. And on this news report at like 6 p.m., the big news report, there was a small screen in the corner of the big screen where they were saying that Yushchenko had been defeated. And it was somebody who was doing sign language for the hearing impaired. And this woman boldly spoke a wildly different message. The brave woman in the small corner of the screen on the news program on election night signed out, "Don't believe what they're saying. They're lying through their teeth. Yushchenko is victorious. Don't believe what they're saying. They're lying through their teeth." Deaf people picked up first and they spread the news. And then just a few days later, there was over 1 million people dressed in orange in what was be called the Orange Revolution in the public square, demanding another count of the votes. And you guess what? Yushchenko had won decisively. They were lying through their teeth. Now, this little screen in the corner of the big screen message, I think this is a powerful and helpful image for the church and for church people. I mean, think about it. Who is on the big screen in our culture? What are the values that people are shouting are the most important? And who's the most valuable in our culture today? I mean, the questions we'd ask is like, ooh, how beautiful you are, or like how thin you are, like that's who really matters, how fit you are, making others desire you, how many people are jealous of you. Like that's what matters most, right? How much money you have, how much power you have, how many fans or followers, and your platform size, your title, like that is the big screen message in our culture, is it not? I mean, think about it. One NBA All-Star makes more annually than all of the members of the U.S. Senate and Congress. And some of you are like, and they're still overpaid. But it shows that not just in our world, like in our culture, the kingdoms of our world have always valued winners over losers, strength over weakness. But the voice of grace whispers, what they're telling you is not the truth. They're lying through their teeth. In Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he stood on a hillside and he kicks it off, talking about a different pecking order, if you will. He says this, blessed, or God's favor is on the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed, God's favor is upon those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Jesus is saying, like, my kingdom is upside down, and the small screen message is the true message. That if you want to be great, you better serve. The first will be last. There's a whole new pecking order in the kingdom of God, and it changes everything. You guys, the big screen story says that the beautiful, powerful, and popular are where our focus should be. The big screen story that our culture tells us is that we need to stick with our own kind and play defense against the others or our enemies. The big screen story says that we need to pay back evil to get even for those who strike us. But the gentle voice of grace whispers, don't believe what they're telling you. They're lying through their teeth. We are invited to rebel against the narratives that our culture have been selling us because they're lying. There's a different way to see the world. There's a different way to see people. And it's through the lens of grace. A couple practical challenges I want to leave us with. A couple things I think can challenge us as we walk out here to practice grace in our lives. First is this. See others with grace-healed eyes. Put on your grace goggles to see the world around you and to see others through grace-healed eyes. Like, this is what Jesus did. He saw people through a different filter. He saw people and he didn't see them as just a collection of their worst moments or an accumulation of their biggest mistakes. He saw them for more than that. I mean, think about it. The desperate, bleeding woman, he saw her as a daughter. Matthew and Zacchaeus, these tax collectors that were traitors to the nation of Israel, he called them into his inner circle. God sees us with grace. And I just want to stop for a moment. Maybe for you, you feel like you are an accumulation of your worst moments, your sins, your destructive behaviors. You are so much more. Your heavenly Father sees you as you really are. And it's so much more than your worst moments. To see others with grace-healed eyes is to be curious about what's going on underneath the surface and see beyond their sin to a hurt, the thing underneath the thing. An absent-minded waitress, a controlling boss, a critical friend. There's always more going on, you guys. Let's be people that have grace-healed eyes to see underneath the sin to a daughter, a son, someone who matters to God. We've all heard it said that everyone is carrying some heavy burden that you can't see. So let's respond with kindness and grace in those moments, and let's dispense grace to them. Next challenge. Let's be people that look out and look low. Remember, grace is never something that was supposed to just be received and breathed in. It was something to be received and breathed in and then breathed out liberally to our grace-thirsty world. So let's look out beyond ourselves, and specifically, let's look low. You know, Christians throughout church history, man, we've gotten this right sometimes, and it's been beautiful. For children, you know, the first orphanages in our world were Christian, and they were done in the name of Jesus, and were there to protect the most vulnerable people in poverty and war. And who were those people? Children. So Christians started orphanages. When there's natural disasters, Christians step up and they go and relieve suffering, to rebuild and to feed. And long after FEMA moves out, you know who's there? The Jesus people are there. And I know those are some like big things that we can't do, but here's some everyday stuff, everyday ways that we can look beyond ourselves, look out and look to the lowest places and dispense grace to them. You know, at church, like even this evening, We should be people that look for people that are shuffling in late and not in a passive-aggressive. We look for people that are shuffling in late, and we smile. We invite them to sit with us. We tell them we're excited to see them. We introduce ourselves and hear their story and share our story. When you're in public and you see a parent who's all alone, looking disheveled, kid is struggling, meltdown zone, and there's no hope in sight, instead of moving away from them, move towards them. Let them know, Mama, like we've all been there. And it gets better. And then it gets worse again. But it gets better, trust me. But move towards them to show them grace. When you see something on the news or online that breaks your heart, where your stomach turns, and that's like meets my compassion way, do something about it. To the lowest places, let it be said that the people of God move in and we disrupt brokenness with grace. And then lastly, overall, don't miss this, you guys. Let's be people that disrupt shame with grace. There are so many people that you work with, that you walk alongside, that you live right next to, and they're a mess, and they feel awful, and they're walking with a limp. They already feel so bad. Let it be said of the Jesus people here at Suncrest Church that we don't shoot our wounded, and we don't heap on the shame. We don't say shame on you. May our calling card be shame off you. A couple years ago, there was a 20-something young man who had no church family history. He started coming to our church, and Jesus just grabbed his life. And he gave his life to Jesus, and he was planning on getting baptized. And the weekend that he was planning on getting baptized, I got a call. And it was my buddy who was getting baptized. He goes, hey, man, I could just hear the guilt and the shame in his voice. And he's telling me, I just don't think I can get baptized this weekend. I don't know if you saw, but I got a DWI. I was at a Halloween party, and it was so stupid, and I can't believe I did this, but then I drove home, and I apparently I'm just not ready, and I'm really sorry if I've embarrassed you. And I mean, just the shame just dripping off of his voice. And I said, buddy, I'm not going to stop you from getting baptized this weekend. Do you love Jesus? Yeah. Do you want to follow Jesus with your life? Yeah. I'm like, then you're getting dunked this weekend, man. It's a hinge moment in his life where what he thought about God, what he thought about church, what he thought about mistakes, it all hung in the balance. And in that moment, I wanted to disrupt the shame with grace. And I got to baptize my buddy. And he serves in our kids' ministry every week to this day. We should be people that disrupt shame with grace. Meet them in their hinge moments when they're expecting getting shunned, and we lift them up. I'll leave you with this. Some of the last words recorded from Jesus. This is after his death, his resurrection, 40 days hanging with his disciples. He's about to give them the keys to the kingdom to go build the church. In the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus says this. He says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. He says, you guys are going to build this thing and be my witnesses to my grace, to my kingdom message, and spread it everywhere. I think the same call from Jesus is for us that call ourselves Christ followers today. We will be his witnesses. But you know the funny thing? That in the court of law, you can't be a witness and stand as prosecution at the same time. We can choose. Will we be people that stand up to condemn people around us, or will we be people that witness and steward the grace of God to people in their guilt and in their shame and in their isolation? Let's get some role clarity, my friends. We're called to be witnesses of our Jesus and his kingdom message and his gospel of grace. It's our role to dispense grace, to practice grace, and it's our calling to join in the great grace rebellion that he started. It's still going on until his kingdom completely fills this earth.
Well, I really hope that was helpful for integrating faith with life. Listen, if you're in Northwest Indiana, I'd love to have you join us in person. Head over to suncrest.org and plan your visit.